frame on the wall is empty now. Not broken, not tilted, just empty. Thomas stares at it from his desk chair, the indent of his fingertips still visible on the dusty glass. But the photograph that was there yesterday morning is gone. Someone has been in his apartment. Someone has been in his life. And the strangest part, he doesn't remember hanging that frame in the first place. 7 days earlier, Thomas Elliot had walked past a bookstore he'd never noticed before, despite having mapped every business within a 5-block radius of his apartment. The storefront looked worn, almost reluctant to be noticed, its faded sign reading Blackwood Books in chipped gold lettering. The kind of place that belonged to another decade, with its cash-only policy handwritten on cardboard in the window, and the bell that announced his entrance with a sound like distant wind chimes. Thomas was not a spontaneous man. At 37, his life operated with the precision of German engineering, from the 5:45 a.m. alarm to the color-coded folders on his laptop where he stored his technical writing projects. His apartment in Northern Oregon was a monument to order. Minimal furniture, labeled storage containers, a pantry organized by expiration date. He found safety in systems after his divorce 2 years ago had upended his life in Massachusetts. But something about this bookstore pulled at him, like a loose thread he couldn't help but tug. Inside, the store was larger than it appeared from the street, with narrow aisles formed by overstuffed shelves. The air smelled of vanilla and old paper. A man with wire-rimmed glasses nodded from behind the counter but didn't speak. Thomas nodded back and drifted toward a bin labeled Photography 559. He wasn't looking for anything in particular, that's what he would tell himself later, but his fingers seemed to know what they wanted, rifling through coffee table books until they landed on a thicker volume bound in navy blue cloth. Moments in the American Northwest, 1990-2005, read the embossed silver lettering. The book was heavier than it looked, as if weighted with more than just paper and ink. Thomas opened it randomly, finding a spread of black and white photos of a lumber mill in Washington. He flipped forward. A county fair in Idaho, children with cotton candy, a carnival worker with haunted eyes. He paid $12 cash and tucked it under his arm. That night, after microwaving a precisely portioned meal of chicken and brown rice, Thomas sat at his kitchen table and properly examined his purchase. The photographer was credited as E.M. Holloway, a name that meant nothing to him. The introduction mentioned that the photos were collected from various contributors, documenting everyday life across Montana, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington during the turn of the millennium. He turned the pages methodically, giving each image equal attention. Gas stations glowing at dusk, motel swimming pools with no swimmers, couples in diners looking past each other. The banality of American life captured with an almost voyeuristic lens. And then, page 87. Thomas blinked, flipped back a page, forward again. There, in a faded color photo with the warm tint of aged Polaroid film, sat a man at a diner counter. The caption read, Travelers Rest Diner, Route 12, Montana, September 2003. The man was turned slightly toward the camera, not posing but caught in the moment of lifting a white ceramic mug to his lips. And the man was, unmistakably, Thomas. Same narrow face, same deep-set eyes, same thin scar cutting through the left eyebrow from a childhood bike accident. Even the way the man's fingers curled around the mug, pinky slightly apart from the others, was Thomas's own unconscious habit. But Thomas had never been to Montana. In 2003, he had been a junior at MIT, buried in computer science textbooks. He hadn't left Massachusetts except for Christmas breaks home to Connecticut. And yet, there he was. The diner looked vaguely familiar in the way that all American diners share a common DNA. Red vinyl booths, speckled linoleum, pie case near the register. But he didn't recognize it, couldn't place it. Thomas set the book down and walked to his bathroom. He leaned toward the mirror, examining the scar above his eyebrow. It was there, just as it had been since he was 8. He returned to the kitchen and studied the photo again, this time with a magnifying glass he kept in a drawer for examining fine print in contracts. The image wasn't high resolution, but it was clear enough. The man wore a grey Henley shirt that Thomas didn't own but would have chosen for himself. The watch on his wrist was an analog Timex with a leather band. Simple, practical. Thomas's style. On the table next to the coffee cup was a folded newspaper and what appeared to be a small notebook with a pen clipped to it. He looked at the other people in the diner. A waitress with her back to the camera, hair in a loose bun. An elderly couple in a booth. A solitary man at the far end of the counter. None of them were looking at the camera or at the man who was Thomas's doppelganger. It was just a moment, captured and preserved like an insect in amber. That night, Thomas dreamed of the diner. He could smell it. Coffee grounds and frying oil and the faint ammonia of recently mopped floors. He could hear the clink of silverware against plates, the low murmur of conversation, Patsy Cline on a jukebox. He knew, without seeing it, that the bathroom was down a narrow hallway past the payphone and that the men's room had a broken lock. You had to jiggle just so. He knew the coffee was bitter, but the pie was homemade, and that the cook, Darren, had a temper, but made the best hash browns in 3 counties. He woke disoriented at 3:17 a.m., his sheets damp with sweat. The dream had been so vivid that for a moment he couldn't remember where he was or what year it was. He got up, drank a glass of water, and stood at his window looking down at the empty street, the book open to page 87 on his kitchen table, reflecting the moonlight. The next morning, Thomas called in sick to the software company where he was contracted to write technical documentation. He never called in sick. His routine was disrupted, and once breached, the entire structure of his day felt unstable. He spent hours online searching for information about Traveller's Rest Diner. It had existed. He found an old review from a local newspaper archived online, mentioning their blue ribbon apple pie and no-nonsense service. It had closed in 2007. The building was now a budget gas station. He emailed the publishers of the photography book, but received an automatic reply that the small press had been acquired by a larger one in 2010, and inquiries should be directed to their archives department. He sent another email and waited. By afternoon, he'd become fixated on the notebook in the photo. It looked like a moleskin, the kind he'd used throughout college and his early career, before switching to digital note-taking. He still had boxes of them somewhere, filled with his precise handwriting. He found himself opening closets, checking storage containers he hadn't touched since moving in, looking for, what, evidence? Proof that he had been in that diner? That he was losing his mind. In the back of his hall closet, behind a box of winter clothes, he found a cardboard box he didn't recognize. It wasn't labeled in his handwriting, just marked MISC in thick black marker. Inside were odds and ends that seemed like the random debris of a life. Keychains, ticket stubs, a baseball cap for a team he didn't follow, a coffee mug from a company he'd never heard of, and at the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, a Timex watch with a worn leather band. Thomas sat on his hallway floor, the watch in his palm. It was identical to the one in the photo. The battery was dead, the hands frozen at 3:17. He placed it on his wrist. It fit perfectly. The next day, Thomas forced himself back into routine. He showered at 6:00 a.m., made coffee at 6:15, was at his computer by 7:00. But his focus was shot. He found himself typing the same sentence 3 times, deleting it, staring at the blinking cursor. His usual precision had abandoned him. He kept glancing at the watch, which he'd set to the correct time and was now wearing, though he couldn't exactly say why. It felt important. At lunch, he called the Montana Historical Society and was connected to a woman named Helen, who specialized in local businesses of the region. "Traveller's Rest?" she said, her voice warm with recognition. "Sure, I knew that place. Used to stop there on the way to my sister's in Missoula. Good pie. Burned down in '07, though, terrible shame." "I'm doing some research," Thomas said, the lie coming easily. "I found a photo from there dated 2003 September. I'm trying to track down information about some of the people in it." "Well, Marge Calloway was the owner, but she passed in 2010. Her daughter might still be around." "The cook was Darren," Thomas said automatically, with a temper. A pause on the line. "That's right, Darren Schiff. Had a short fuse, but cooked like a dream. How'd you know that?" Thomas's mouth went dry. "Lucky guess. What about the regulars?" Would there have been records or... Not really, honey, it was just a highway diner. People passed through, some stayed longer than others. He described himself, the man in the photo, and asked if she recognized him. Could have been anyone, she said after a moment. Lot of folks on that highway. Truckers, tourists, people running to or from something. She paused again. You sound like you're looking for someone specific. Just trying to piece something together, he said. After the call, Thomas sat very still at his desk. How had he known the cook's name? It had come to him as naturally as his own. Just like in the dream, he'd known the layout of the diner. The broken lock on the bathroom door, the taste of the coffee. Details he couldn't possibly know, unless he had been there. That evening, he found himself pulling up his old college social media accounts, looking for photos from 2003. There weren't many. It was before smartphones, before the documentation of every moment became automatic. But he found a few from that September. A campus event on the 10th, a birthday party on the 22nd. He was in both, looking younger, hair longer, the same scar visible above his eyebrow, so he couldn't have been in Montana. And yet, the man in the diner was him, not just someone who looked like him. It was him. He knew it with a certainty that defied logic. He went back to the bookstore the next day, but found only an empty storefront. The windows were covered with brown paper from the inside, no sign of Blackwood Books anywhere. The adjacent shop, a dry cleaner, had always been there, according to the owner. No bookstore in between, not in the 8 years she'd been operating. But I was just here, Thomas insisted. 3 days ago. The woman shrugged. Maybe you're thinking of Reed's? That's on 4th, about 6 blocks over. Thomas knew he wasn't confused. He hadn't imagined the bookstore with its cash-only sign and the bell over the door, just as he hadn't imagined the photo in the book, or the watch in the box, or the dream of a diner he'd never visited. Back home, he called his ex-wife Jennifer. They spoke rarely, brief check-ins every few months that were more habit than necessity. She answered on the 4th ring, her voice cautious. Thomas? Everything okay? You never call on weekdays. I need to ask you something, he said, pacing his kitchen. Do you remember where I was in September 2003? A pause. That was junior year? We were both at MIT. Why? Did I ever go to Montana? Maybe for a long weekend or... Montana? No. You barely left the computer lab that semester. She hesitated. Are you all right? You sound odd. I'm fine, he lied. Just fact-checking something for work. After they hung up, Thomas pulled out the photo again. He'd scanned it at high resolution, printed it on glossy paper. He stared at the image of himself, the self he had no memory of being, sitting in that Montana diner. And then he noticed something he'd missed before. In the background, reflected in a mirror behind the counter, was the photographer, just a silhouette, the camera raised to their face. But something about the stance seemed familiar. Thomas decided he needed to see the place for himself. He booked a flight to Montana for the weekend, reserved a rental car. The decision felt reckless and necessary all at once. He needed to stand where that other version of himself had stood, needed to see if being there would trigger some locked memory, some explanation for the impossible. The night before his flight, he dreamed again of the diner, but this time it was different. He was sitting at the counter, but when he looked down, the hands gripping the coffee mug weren't his. They were older, with prominent veins and a wedding ring he'd never worn. He looked up and saw himself, the self from the photo, sitting at a booth across the room, writing in a notebook. Neither version of Thomas acknowledged the other. The cook, Darren, set a plate of eggs before him, saying, "Third time this week. Beginning to think you live here." But his mouth didn't match his words like a badly dubbed film. Thomas woke with a start, reaching instinctively for the watch on his nightstand. 3:17 a.m. Again. He switched on the lamp and found himself looking at the framed photo on his wall, the one from the book. But he hadn't framed it, hadn't hung it. Yet there it was, in a simple black frame, exactly where a similar frame had always held a print of the Boston skyline. He approached it slowly, as if it might vanish if he moved too quickly. The glass reflected his face, superimposing his current self over the image of his past self. or future self, or parallel self. He no longer knew which was which. The frame was secured with two small hooks, the type he always used, his own preference for hanging pictures. He lifted it from the wall, turning it over. There was no backing, no photograph. The frame was empty. He looked up at the wall again, and there was the photo, still hanging exactly where it had been. Thomas stepped back, heart hammering in his chest. He closed his eyes, counted to 10, opened them again. The frame was empty. On the wall and in his hands, there had never been a photo there. Just dust and the slight discoloration of the paint where something had hung for a long time. In the morning, Thomas cancelled his flight. Whatever answers waited in Montana, he was no longer sure. He wanted them. Instead, he drove to the public library and spent hours searching through newspaper archives, looking for any mention of Travelers Rest Diner beyond the single review he'd found online. In the microfiche records of a local Montana paper, he found a small article from October 2003. Highway diner scene of strange disappearance. A man had been seen regularly at the diner for about 2 weeks in September, always alone, always writing in a notebook. On the last day he was seen, he left his coffee half finished, his notebook on the counter, and walked out the door. His rental car remained in the parking lot for 3 days before being reported to the police. The man was never identified, never found. The article mentioned that the only clue to his identity was the notebook, which contained what appeared to be technical writing about computer systems that didn't exist, and a Massachusetts driver's license that authorities determined was a sophisticated fake. The name on the license was Thomas Elliott. Thomas sat frozen at the library terminal, the words blurring before his eyes. It wasn't possible. None of it was possible. And yet, like the watch that fit his wrist perfectly, it felt true in a way that transcended logic. That night, Thomas found himself standing in front of the empty bookstore again. The paper was still in the windows, but now there was a small sign. Opening soon, Blackwood Books. It hadn't been there that morning. He was sure of it. As he turned to leave, he noticed something tucked into the doorframe, a postcard. He picked it up. On the front was a photo of Travelers Rest Diner, taken from the parking lot, the neon, sign glowing against a twilight sky. He turned it over. It was blank except for a series of numbers in the center, 91703, 317. Thomas walked home, the postcard burning in his pocket like a hot coal. In his apartment, everything looked different somehow, as if someone had moved each item just slightly out of place. His books were in the right order, but one was upside down. The coffee maker was on the wrong side of the counter. His laptop was open when he was certain he'd closed it. He checked his email and found a response from the publishing company. The photography book, Moments in the American Northwest, was not in their catalog and never had been. The photographer E.M. Holloway was unknown to them. They suggested he might be confusing it with a similar title, but the book was still on his shelf. He pulled it down, opened to page 87. The page was blank. He flipped through the entire book. Every photo was there, except that one, as if it had been carefully removed with a razor, leaving not even a scar in the paper. Thomas sat at his kitchen table, the empty page before him, a postcard beside it, the watch on his wrist ticking steadily. He reached for his phone to call. Who? Who would believe him? Who would understand what was happening when he himself didn't understand? He opened his laptop instead and began to type, documenting everything that had happened since he found the book, the diner, the photo, the dreams, the watch, the newspaper article, the vanishing bookstore. It was after midnight when he finished, his eyes burning from staring at the screen. He saved the document, closed his laptop, and went to the bathroom to splash water on his face. In the mirror, he noticed the scar above his eyebrow looked different, longer than he remembered, with a slight hook at the end that had never been there before. He touched it gently. It felt old, fully healed. When he returned to the kitchen, his laptop was open again. The document he'd just written was gone from his files. In its place was a different document, titled simply, Again. He opened it. It contained just 3 paragraphs. This is the fourth time I've tried to warn myself. Each attempt changes something. The photo, the watch, the scar. Small details shifting like sand under waves. I don't know if you're reading this now, or if I'm writing to a ghost. But if you are there, if I am there, don't go looking for answers. The diner is a nexus point, a place where something bent. I've been trying to find my way back for 20 years. Each time I get close, reality shifts. Again, the next time you see the bookstore, walk past it. The next time you dream of the diner, wake up. The next time you find evidence that you're not who you think you are, burn it. Some doors aren't meant to be opened. Some paths loop back on themselves forever. The document vanished as he was. Reading it, the screen flashing blue for an instant before returning to the desktop. Thomas tried to find it in his recently opened files, in the trash, in the cloud backup. It was gone, as if it had never existed. He sat back in his chair, a chill spreading through him despite the warm night. On the kitchen counter, he noticed a coffee stain in the shape of a perfect ring, though he hadn't made coffee that day. Beside it sat his keys and a folded napkin he didn't recognize. Slowly, he unfolded the napkin. Written in blue ink, in what was unmistakably his own handwriting, were the words, "Don't follow it, not again." Thomas looked around his apartment. Everything was still. Nothing moved. But something, some quality of the air, some subtle shift in the light, had changed, as if reality itself had been slightly rearranged around him. He sat perfectly still, listening to the sound of his own breathing, to the tick of the watch on his wrist, to the silence beneath it all. He no longer knew which version of himself was real. The one who had never been to Montana? The one who disappeared from a diner in 2003? The one who had been trying to warn himself across time or space or whatever strange boundary had been crossed? Perhaps they were all real. Perhaps none of them were. Thomas carefully folded the napkin and placed it in his pocket next to the postcard from a bookstore that both did and didn't exist. Then he closed his laptop, turned off the lights and went to bed. He didn't dream of the diner that night. He didn't dream at all. If this story held your attention until now, like the video and subscribe. The next one might be waiting for you right now. And there's one more and waiting just over there. Maybe it explains what was missing from this one. Maybe it makes everything worse. You heard it, but not everything was told.